China buried billions of seeds in one of the driest places on Earth. And then they waited. Years later, satellite images showed something strange. Where there had once been endless desert, there was now green paradise. What happened in northern China is not some science fiction story. It's part of a real, ongoing project so massive it can be seen from space. A human attempt to stop a desert from swallowing the land. The idea sounds simple. Plant trees, fight sand. But this is not a few rows of seedlings. This is the largest reforestation effort in history, and one of the most ambitious environmental experiments ever attempted. So, why did China bury billions of seeds in the desert, and did it actually work? Let's take a closer look. Northern China has a desert problem, and it's not a small one. Over the last several decades, the Gobi Desert has been creeping south at an alarming rate, swallowing up farmland, damaging infrastructure, and pushing people out of their homes. By the late 20th century, more than 25% of China's total land area was affected by desertification. Entire villages were buried in sand, crops failed, rivers dried up, and in spring, massive sandstorms would roll through the country, sometimes reaching as far as Beijing, turning the sky orange and shutting down daily life. The causes were not just natural. Centuries of deforestation had stripped away the native vegetation that once held the soil in place. Overgrazing by livestock, especially in fragile grasslands, removed even more of the ground cover. Add to that years of poor irrigation practices, droughts, and the pressure of feeding a growing population, and the result was predictable. The land simply broke down. In the 1970s, China was losing an estimated 2,500 square kilometers of productive land to desertification every single year. That's roughly the size of Luxembourg, gone annually. And with over 400 million people living in or near areas affected by desertification, this was not just an environmental issue. It was an economic crisis, a health risk, a national security concern. So the question was not whether China should respond, it was how. And the answer they came up with was bold. Fight sand with forests. In 1978, the Chinese government launched the 3 North Shelter Belt Program, also known as the Great Green Wall of China, a long-term, multi-decade effort to plant massive belts of forest across the country's north, northeast, and northwest regions. Collectively, these zones formed the front line against the Gobi Desert's advance. The basic idea was to build a wall. Not out of bricks or concrete, but out of living trees, a biological barrier that could block wind, stabilize soil, hold in moisture, and eventually bring the land back to life. The plan covered over 4,500 kilometers, cutting across 12 provinces. It was structured in stages, with each phase targeting specific regions and ecological zones. The timeline stretched all the way to 2050. But the goal was not just to plant trees and walk away. The program also aimed to rehabilitate degraded farmland, prevent soil erosion, protect water sources, and create sustainable rural livelihoods in the process. China used a range of strategies. In some areas, they did reforestation, bringing back tree cover to previously forested land. In others, they focused on afforestation, planting trees in places that had never supported forests before. They also introduced agroforestry systems, where trees were grown alongside crops and livestock to balance productivity and environmental protection. This was not just a government program. It involved millions of farmers, workers, and students, many of whom planted trees as part of civic campaigns or local employment projects. By some estimates, more than 66 billion trees have been planted under the program so far, making it the largest tree planting effort in human history. Still, the idea of greening a desert sounds optimistic on paper. In practice, it came with massive technical, logistical, and environmental challenges. So how do you actually plant trees in a place where almost nothing grows? Planting trees in a desert is not as simple as digging a hole and dropping in a seedling. The soil is dry, the wind is relentless, and the rain, when it comes at all, often arrives as short, intense bursts that cause more erosion than growth. To deal with this, China had to get creative. In the early phases, much of the planting was done by hand or with basic tools. Local workers, often from nearby villages, were mobilized in large numbers. In some regions, even school children were given small trees to plant as part of community campaigns. But as the project scaled up, new tools came into play. One major breakthrough was aerial seeding, the use of planes and helicopters to scatter seeds across vast remote areas. It allowed China to plant trees in places that were too difficult or dangerous to reach by foot. Then came drip irrigation systems, water-efficient setups that delivered moisture directly to the roots of new trees, minimizing waste in an already water-scarce environment. Scientists also tested hundreds of tree species to figure out which ones could survive the harsh conditions. In the early years, fast-growing trees like poplar and Chinese pine were common choices. Later, they introduced more drought-tolerant species, such as sea buckthorn, which also helped fix nitrogen in the soil. Monitoring all this was a challenge, but with advances in satellite imagery and remote sensing, China began to track the program's progress from space, measuring forest cover, vegetation health, and areas of recovery. They also launched experimental zones where researchers tested combinations of trees, shrubs, and grasses to find the most sustainable mixes for different types of terrain. By the 2000s, the project had become far more sophisticated, blending large-scale planning with ecological science and new technologies. Still, not every region responded the same way, and not every tree survived, but in places where it worked, the results were hard to ignore. In some regions, the transformation has been dramatic. Take the Kabuki Desert in Inner Mongolia. Once an endless stretch of shifting dunes, this area has seen more than half its surface reclaimed by vegetation. Over 6,000 square kilometers have been stabilized and regreened, not just with trees, but with a carefully planned mix of shrubs and grasses that anchor the soil and retain moisture. What used to be barren sand is now home to orchards, grazing land, and even solar farms. Incomes in the region have risen, and dust storms have dropped significantly. Then there's the Muus Desert, where local efforts combined with national support led to the recovery of large patches of land. Formerly unusable terrain is now being farmed again, producing potatoes, millet, and medicinal herbs. In these areas, the goal was not just to plant as many trees as possible, it was to restore functioning ecosystems, the kind that can survive on their own once established. And it's working. According to satellite data from NASA and the European Space Agency, China is now responsible for roughly 25% of the global increase in green vegetation since the early 2000s, much of it due to projects like this one. In cities like Beijing, once choked by annual dust storms, the improvement has been noticeable. The frequency and severity of these storms have dropped, and the air quality, while still a concern, has improved during peak storm season. These successes show what's possible when ecological goals align with political will, long-term investment, and community participation. But the story doesn't end here, because while parts of the desert turned green, not all of it stayed that way. For all its scale and ambition, the Great Green Wall has not been without problems. In the early years, many of the tree planting campaigns focused on quantity over quality. Local officials were under pressure to meet planting targets, and that often meant fast-growing species planted in monoculture blocks, large areas covered with just one kind of tree like poplar or larch. These trees were quick to grow but poorly suited to the harsh desert environment. They required more water than the land could support. Many of them died within a few years. In some areas, mortality rates reached 70% or higher. Even worse, the widespread use of a single species made forests more vulnerable to disease and pests. Entire sections of forest failed when they were hit by drought or insect infestations. There were also unintended consequences underground. In places where thirsty trees were planted in dry soil, they pulled water from already stressed aquifers. Over time, this lowered the water table, making it harder for other vegetation to survive, including native grasses that had once stabilized the sand. Some critics also raised social concerns. In certain regions, communities were relocated to make space for tree plantations. Farmers were required to stop grazing livestock on designated reforestation areas, even when those lands had traditionally supported herding for generations. These problems sparked public debate. Was this truly environmental restoration, or just tree farming on a massive scale? Chinese scientists began raising the alarm too, warning that the early approach was unsustainable. Planting trees is not the same as restoring an ecosystem, and without local support and proper ecological planning, the benefits might not last. To its credit, the government responded. In the 2000s and 2010s, the program began to shift. The focus moved from raw numbers to forest quality, biodiversity, and long-term survival. And that brings us to the next phase of the project, one shaped more by science than by slogans. After decades of trial and error, China began adjusting its approach. The focus moved away from simply planting trees and toward building resilient ecosystems. This meant switching to native species, increasing biodiversity, and improving how forests were managed over time. One of the biggest changes was moving from monocultures to mixed species forests. In many regions, local grasses and shrubs were reintroduced alongside drought-tolerant trees. These combinations proved more stable, required less water, and did a better job of holding the soil soil together. Forests were also treated as part of a broader landscape, not as isolated blocks. That meant protecting rivers, rebuilding wetlands, and in some cases, allowing nature to take the lead through natural regeneration instead of forced planting. Technology played a growing role. With satellite imaging, scientists could track vegetation health, detect early signs of drought stress, and monitor the long-term survival rates of planted zones. Artificial intelligence and remote sensors helped identify where the land was recovering and where it wasn't. This allowed the government to make more targeted interventions and avoid repeating earlier mistakes. Training programs were introduced for local communities, especially farmers and herders, so that they could manage the forests sustainably. Instead of being excluded from the land, they were brought into the process. In some areas, farmers were compensated for maintaining tree cover or given incentives to switch to agroforestry, which integrates trees into agricultural production. There was also a growing recognition that forests alone weren't enough, so the Green Wall program was gradually integrated into broader conservation efforts, like grassland restoration, soil protection, and climate adaptation planning. The shift was not just technical, it reflected a deeper understanding that ecosystems are complex and success depends not on planting more trees, but planting the right trees in the right way for the right reasons. And as this new model took shape, it raised another question. Could China's experience be a model for the rest of the world? China's Great Green Wall is often seen as a domestic project, but its lessons reach far beyond its borders. Desertification is not just a Chinese issue, it's a global one. According to the United Nations, over 100 countries face some form of land degradation, affecting the lives of more than 3 billion people. From sub-Saharan Africa to Central Asia to parts of North America, drylands are expanding, and with them come drought, food insecurity, and forced migration. One of the most ambitious responses outside China is Africa's Great Green Wall, a plan to plant trees and restore land across the Sahel, from Senegal to Ethiopia. It was inspired in part by China's program, but the context is different. Less centralized authority, more fragile governance, and harsher economic conditions. Still, many of the same lessons apply. Other countries have started adopting elements of this approach. India is investing in desert greening in Rajasthan. Pakistan has launched reforestation efforts in the Indus River Basin. Iran, Mongolia, and even parts of the Middle East are studying shelter belt systems and dust control strategies. And while each case is different, they all face a similar question. How do you fix land that's already broken without making it worse in the process? China's experience doesn't offer a perfect answer, but it does offer something useful, a real-world experiment run over decades with measurable results, both good and bad. And that makes it one of the most important environmental stories on the planet. After more than 4 decades, the question remains, did China's Great Green Wall actually succeed? The answer depends on how you define success. In terms of scale, it's unmatched. Over 66 billion trees planted, roughly 30 million hectares of land restored. That's an area larger than Italy, and the environmental impact is visible from space. Satellite imagery from NASA and Chinese space agencies shows a steady increase in vegetation across large sections of northern China. Between 2000 and 2017, China accounted for more than 1/4 of global net increase in green cover, the highest of any country during that period. The early mistakes, monocultures, water stress, social displacement, serve as reminders that large-scale restoration can go wrong just as easily as it can go right. And the job is far from finished. The program is scheduled to continue until at least 2050, and the long-term success depends on whether these restored ecosystems can sustain themselves without constant human intervention. The Great Green Wall of China is not perfect. It made mistakes, it faced setbacks, and in some places it's still struggling. But it also shows that when countries think long-term, and when people work with nature instead of against it, the land can recover. It's not fast, it's not easy, but it's possible. So here's the question, should more countries try this? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, see you soon in the next video.